All right, so it is noon, so we're going to go ahead and get started. We'll keep letting people into the event as they join us, but thank you all for being here. This is our first graduate student speaker event of the semester, and I'm very excited to have Katie Powell as our first speaker, and also as our guinea pig as we as we figure out how to do this virtually. So my name is Kara Flynn. I'm the Research and Educational Services Archivist here in Special Collections. And I've been running this series for the past few semesters. It was initially run by Lori Burrell, the Associate Dean of Special Collections, who began the series in 2018. And it's presented in partnership with the Graduate School and International Education. And the goal here is to provide graduate students with a forum in which to present their research and to gain some experience in public speaking. So I'm excited that we were able to transition this to an online format. I'd like to thank Kelsey, the library's PR director, for helping to promote the series, my colleagues in Special Collections for also helping to promote the event, serving as backup Zoom logistics support, and volunteering to be Zoom test subjects as I figured out how to get this online. So this year we're excited to have students from two disciplines that are new to the series, English, Katie, and then fine arts with our speaker in November. So like I said, today we will be hearing from Katie W. Powell, a doctoral student in the Rhetoric and Composition Program within the Department of English. And she is also the Associate Director of Student Success with the University of Arkansas Honors College. As part of her dissertation, Katie explores the ways in which communities remember, including what a community chooses not to remember. In this presentation, she'll cover her work diving into the Barry, Dickinson, and Peel family papers, which is a collection housed in our Special Collections. And they were three prominent Bentonville families at the turn of the century. From official documentation to ephemeral artifacts like letters or photos, the women of these Bentonville families were foundational to a Confederate memory that remains tied to the community today. So before we get started with Katie's presentation, I wanted to go over a couple of logistical things related to how we'll be using Zoom for today's event. First, all attendees' videos will remain off throughout the presentation, and all participants will be muted as they enter. I will be moderating a brief Q&A session at the end of Katie's presentation. So if you have a question that you'd like to ask Katie that comes up for you during the presentation or at the end, I would ask you to go ahead and put that question in the chat, and then I will pose those chat questions to Katie during the Q&A. If we encounter any logistical technical problems today, our backup plan is that we'll end the Zoom event and I will send out a YouTube link. So we'll make this presentation live in YouTube shortly thereafter. And anyone who's registered for the event today will receive that YouTube link as soon as it's up. And everyone will receive it no matter what, in case they couldn't make it today during our live event. So that is the plan. So I'm going to go ahead, and it's going to take me just a second to get Katie's presentation up. I will be turning off my video during the presentation, as will Katie, and then we'll put our videos back on for the Q&A. And the presentation is closed captioned for accessibility, but the rest of the presentation, the Q&A part will not be captioned. All right.
that my presentation, I'm an English doctoral student. Hi everyone, my name is Katie Powell and I'm a doctoral candidate in the English department with an emphasis in rhetoric and composition. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm honored to be here and I so appreciate you taking the time to listen to my talk this afternoon. And I look forward to discussing a little bit more about my topic on the fight for home and fatherland, a look inside the James H. Berry United Daughters of the Confederacy. Just want to start off by saying that my presentation, I'm an English doctoral student, and so though my project is inherently historical, I am focused more broadly on the rhetoric that the women are using and how that rhetoric continues and the legacy that it has in the present day. So I just wanted to share that before I jump in. Very excited to share my talk with you. I also wanted to share a couple of acknowledgements before we really jump in, mostly for our special collections staff. They are an invaluable resource. I would highly recommend jumping into special collections with any discipline. I feel like, and maybe I'm incorrect in this, that it's most common perhaps for history students to take on the special collections. But it's a wonderful journey and the staff are wonderful. Blair Hollander, first and foremost, has always answered my questions, reached out with other ideas, and just most importantly, gotten really excited with me when a certain item catches my interest or I find kind of a missing piece to the puzzle that I'm working on. So Blair, thank you so much for your work. Joshua Youngblood actually wrote a blog on this very topic that is cited in my sources. I would encourage you to check it out if you're interested. Jeffrey Stark knows everything there is to know about special collections. It feels like he's a wealth of information and always gave me such great advice. Kara Flynn, of course, is who I believe organized this event, or at least is who contacted me to put this event together. So Kara, thank you so much for your support. In addition, Kara helped lead a community archivist workshop this summer that was really valuable to me to have conversation. I also wanted to thank the University of Arkansas English Department, namely my committee members, Dr. Adam Pope and Dr. Joe Hsu, who is actually now at University of Texas in Austin, and then Dr. Kirsten Erickson, who is a member of the anthropology department here at the university, but is a wonderful resource for me and a constant source of support. Lastly, I want to thank the Honors College. I am a staff member in the Honors College, and so they really are a second family to me and have been so supportive even when this work takes me away from them and from my job. I really appreciate it. And then, of course, my family and friends who have constantly cheered me on in this work. So thank you. So I wanted to offer a quick prelude before we jump too far in saying that my research focuses very broadly on the way communities remember. I'm specifically interested in Southern memory, and as I'm sure many of you can relate to, I've taken a keen interest in the ongoing debate surrounding the future of Confederate monuments and memorials. Part of my dissertation has involved tracking the conversations surrounding the Bentonville Confederate Monument, which, as many of you know, has now been removed. So the picture I've chosen is not of the Confederate monument itself, which might have driven some of you to this talk. It's of a garden being put in place of the monument, which I think is a really important sign for some questions that I've been asking myself. Today, however, I will only spend a little time talking about this contested monument, as I believe that the women that placed it there, the James H. Berry chapter of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, have had a much greater impact than merely to put a block of stone on a town square. Most importantly, I have a strong conviction that simply removing said block of stone from said town square doesn't automatically remove the racism, exclusion, and other critical inequities that exist in our community today. So how do we begin talking about and considering those inequities? How do we shape our conversations, our understanding of our own community? Basically, a question maybe you're asking yourself too, is where do we go from here? So to start answering that for me, I wanted to take you a little bit into the background of what's informing my project before we dive deeply into my work with special collections. Though it might not be quite what you came for, I find it important, and I've probably spent too much time in my dissertation trying to explain it, to share the ideas that have really grounded me in this work. So to start answering that question, I turn to a better understanding of ancestorship. Many have taken up the difficult work of tapping into the network of ancestors that have come before us. which I find to be a core tenet of the important work of special collections. For my particular project, I believe that means taking up the hard work of confronting my community ancestors and listening to the role they play in my life today. I'll preface by saying that overwhelmingly, the work I found that is explicitly centered around ancestorship is from the voices of African American scholars about listening and learning from their African and African American ancestors. Dr. Jacqueline Jones Royster, for instance, employs African concepts and critical imagination in order to understand the network of scholars that have contributed to work today. And that photo, Feminist Rhetorical Practices, is her book. Highly recommend it. It's a wonderful piece that's really, I think, shaped and challenged our field. Dr. Eric Darnell Pritchard, who is pictured here and will be on faculty with us this spring, so it's very exciting, explores the role of these ancestors in the literacy and rhetorical practices of queer sexualities and genders. Others, like Gumbs, Alexis Pauline Gumbs to be exact, who I've heard on podcasts and in her just amazing poetry, find their ancestors by cultivating abilities as a seer or a conjurer. And so I shared specifically, it's a little bit long, but a poem that Alexis Pauline Gumbs wrote that I think is really valuable as a way to reflect. So I want to just read that out loud, sort of as a dedication to my own ancestors in this work. If you gathered them, they would be everyone. Gather them. Recognize them in your jawline, your wet eyes, your long-fingered hands. Seeking what but this multitude? If you gathered them, they would not fit on this island. They would spill back into the ocean whence they came. When you gather them, they will have fins and claws and names you do not know. Gather them anyway. Some will look you in the eye. Some are too microscopic to see. If you don't gather them all, you will never be free. If you gathered them, you could not hold them, scold them, demand back what you think is lost. Gather them today, or your soul is the cost. Gather the ones who sold, and who bought, and who tossed overboard. Gather the erstwhile children in the name of the Lord. Gather the unclaimed fathers, the ones with guns and with swords. Gather them up, with your hands, with your relationship to land, with your chin set. You are not done yet. You never will. Gather them more, gather them still. They will unfound you and surround you, unfind you and unwind you. Travel to you, unravel through your own needle. Gather the thread, collect your dead. When I explore these works, I think of the oft-quoted phrase, I am my ancestors' wildest dreams. My ancestors, whether literal or communal, and just as a preface, I am not from Northwest Arkansas, so I don't think I can trace literal ancestors back to this area, but I haven't tried, so you never know. My ancestors, whether literal or communal, are likely not cheering me on in this work. As you might have noticed, or probably assumed, I am white and I identify as a female. When I take up the hard and problematic job of examining my ancestral connections in this community, I could reasonably trace them back to the white women of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. Based on what I'm telling you today, I might, and hopefully would, be my ancestors' worst nightmare, or at least a pestering worry that leaves them awake at night. However, those networks and publics are very much a part of me. Even if I can't trace my literal roots back to Northwest Arkansas, I surely have benefited from the structures of white supremacy that we grapple with as a society today. And so I step gingerly into the work of communal ancestorship with the hope of using the work to listen at last to where I fit into this community decision space. But I also want to mention that I step gingerly and consciously into this work as a white educated female who is not native to Northwest Arkansas or even to this state. I grew up in Mississippi. I recognize that I have shortcomings and blind spots in my perspectives, my interpretations, and in the voices I include and ignore. My dissertation is broadly arguing for a new way to do what's called community listening. I won't regale you with the details, but I will give you a small spoiler alert and let you know that it's really complicated and really important to recognize who you are in this work. So as I step gingerly into this community ancestorship space, I want to say that I'm very open to questions, challenges, concerns, and perspectives that you do not feel are addressed in this space. And I truly mean that. Please reach out. I am a student. I am learning. I need to know where my shortcomings are. So if you're willing, I would love your input. So now I want to jump into special collections by first kind of framing the James H. Barrie chapter of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. So to start learning more about who I am, considering my communal ancestors, the James H. Barrie chapter of the UDC, the largest wealth of information, is housed right here on campus in our special collections. In many ways, the James H. Barrie United Daughters of the Confederacy are a perfect case study, as they mirror chapters from around the country at the turn of the century. Formally founded in 1894, the National United Daughters of the Confederacy, according to Karen Cox, offered Southern women the opportunity to vindicate the Confederate generation and simultaneously uphold the values of their race and class. These women inherited a desire for vindication from their mothers, who were the founders of memorial associations that cared for the graves of Confederate veterans. The UDC held significant power at the turn of the century, partially because their efforts to maintain reputations and expectations of Southern ladiness, all while influencing the ways in which the Confederacy is remembered. The Civil War, at least from the Confederate perspective, was highly communal, as community members sewed uniforms, raised money, cared for the sick, and maintained life as they knew it, or as they were able to, while the majority of their able-bodied men were at war. This communal influence continued into the United Daughters of the Confederacy, which led to the installation of monuments and memorials throughout the South. Cox asserts that 93% of Civil War monuments were built after 1895, which is long after the Civil War, and 1/2 of them were unveiled between 1903 and 1912, which was also a peak time in United Daughters of the Confederacy membership growth. Local United Daughters of the Confederacy chapters, such as the chapter in Bentonville, almost single-handedly raised funds for the statue of the common soldier to be put in their cemetery or town square. As I've mentioned, these women were elite, white, and Southern for generations back, giving them power and influence to meet their fundraising goals. Though local chapters fundraise through tea parties, ice cream socials, and picnics, they receive the majority of the money to resurrect a statue by imploring, which I would personally read as bullying actually when you read some of the records, their prominent Confederate men to donate to the cause. They were then lauded and praised at the elaborate unveiling of these monuments for their efforts to maintain the tradition of their gender and of their past and of their mothers. As I mentioned, this is kind of a vindication for their mothers and grandmothers who were these sort of faithful women of the 1860s that cared for their men. So I won't get into the unveiling of our particular monument, but the unveilings were huge community events that were very extensive. So right in the middle of the boom in membership and monument building for the United Daughters of the Confederacy, a group of women in Bentonville, Arkansas, decided to found their own chapter with what appeared to be the intent to put up a Confederate statue on their town square. Fittingly, the one instance that I have found to mark the actual founding of the James H. Barrie United Daughters of the Confederacy in 1904 comes from the United Daughters of the Confederacy / the United Confederate Veterans national publication, which is called the Confederate Veteran. The article states, and I have the quote here, that, quote, "We are working hard that we may do some honor to the brave heroes who fought for the sweet sunny South. Our ambition at present is to erect a monument to the soldiers of Benton County. There are many here whose hairs are silvering from the frost of time," unquote. And as a side note, the Special Collections houses all issues of their, I don't know if it's all issues, I can't quote that, but many, or if not most, issues of the Confederate Veteran, at least from the past. So it's a wealth of information if this is a topic that's of interest to you. Of particular interest, I think, for me was looking at the advertisements for the monuments memorials. As you might have heard through the discourse that we've had this summer, many of these were mass produced. And so our monument is very similar to a lot of monuments around the country in that they were mass produced, kind of cheaply built, and sent around the country right in the middle of this time. So just wanted to let you know. Also, as a side note, so the photo that you see on your left is one of the few photos I found that's explicitly of women of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, I believe dressed up for a United Daughters of the Confederacy event. So I intentionally left it up for a long time because I've spent a lot of time just looking at this photo. I think it's an important important to see these 5 women who made such an influence on our community today, and have been such a big part of the conversation we've had this summer and continue to have, especially for me. But the naming of the James H. Barrie chapter comes from James H. Barrie, as you might have guessed. So the group decided to name themselves after James H. Barrie, who served as a Civil War officer, lawyer, Arkansas legislator, Speaker of the Arkansas House, and circuit judge for the 4th Judicial District before being elected Arkansas's 14th governor. He lost his leg in the Battle of Corinth during the Civil War and used many of his war connections in his political campaigns throughout the state of Arkansas. He was highly active in planning Civil War reunions, which originally involved both Union and Confederate soldiers, before evolving into strictly Confederate reunions. So he originally started a group to do a joint reunion with Union and Confederate, but it morphed into Confederate reunions. His wife and female relatives, who were connected by blood and marriage to the Dickinsons and the Peels, were affluent and highly influential members of early Bentonville society. And this is a photo of James H. Barrie there on the right. So the MC 1372 collection, the Barrie, Dickinson, and Peel papers, houses everything I've learned about these women since that initial founding in 1904. So according to the library's website, which has an amazing reading guide, so that was the first place I went when I started researching this, was just to sort through box by box, giving you sort of a summary of what you might find there. So according to the library's website, quote, "The materials in this collection are primarily items collected by Ruth Dickinson Barrie, who was born in 1880 and passed away in 1973, and her daughter, Mary Barrie Preston, who was born in 1914 and passed away in 1997. The materials in the Barrie, Dickinson, and Peel family papers, and this is also from the library's website, are a diverse accumulation of records, which includes family correspondence, political, legal, and financial documents, school records, scrapbooks, albums and notebooks, greeting cards, clipping files, notes for newspaper articles, records of institutions, clubs and agencies, notes on family genealogy, a few bound volumes kept by family members, and photographs and postcards." So in this collection, one can find letters as far back as 1830, which I've got a photo of here, and as recently as 1960, 1970. It's a huge collection. In order to start learning more about the women, I started from the beginning and looked through every box. Don't worry, I won't take you through every single box, but I do want to provide some highlights should you be interested in browsing yourself. Box 1, for instance, has actual items from the Civil War, poems and letters, as well as family letters that speak to the goings-on of society at the time. Box 9 is the box that contains many of Barrie's speeches, letters, and other mementos from his political career that some of you might find interesting for further reads. Box 11 features a lot of fun scrapbooks from the children of the families, including their elementary and college years. Box 13 has tons of photos, some of which I've posted here. For my research, though, I want to take you through a few highlights of the women of the UDC. Though seemingly minor, the remnants of the life that they left behind begin to give us a sense of their values, their ideals, and the Confederate memory that they imposed on their community today. So I'm going to get started with this video, and I've learned that if I turn the sound off, you can just sort of watch, because I'm just flipping through it. It's a silent video, so it's easier to keep it silent. So the first, and probably the artifact that I returned to time and time again, is this book of minutes. So the James H. Barrie United Daughters of the Confederacy, like the National United Daughters of the Confederacy, has left behind extensive notes on their daily operations that point to their own instances of retroactivated memory. A minutes book of the chapter records the chapter's events from 1913 to 1933, which you can see in my very professionally done video here. Various references pepper the book with essay contests, beautification efforts, and fundraisers for aging veterans and their families. The chapter acknowledged core values that were inspired by the national organization they were affiliated with. Group records also indicate educational programs that focus on various historical topics. For instance, a 1916 meeting featured a report on, quote, old plantation days, and records mention that questions were asked about slavery and answered within the group. In honor of Robert E. Lee's birthday, the January 1923 meeting mentions that, quote, Mrs. W.J. Bullock made an eloquent and scholarly address in which she paid beautiful tribute to Lee the Idol of the South, and closed with a delightful tribute to the Daughters of the Confederacy and the educational, memorial, and historical work of the organization, unquote. The only mention of African Americans includes a 1930s reference to an educational program on spirituals. Other topics cited include the story of David O'Dodd, Robert E. Lee, interesting occurrences of the South, the Battle of Pea Ridge, and the life of Jefferson Davis. And so this video here, and I'll get actually to the specific letter here in a little bit, and I'll quote it. So if you can't read it, don't worry about it, but I thought that was an especially interesting letter. I transcribed this book of minutes actually because I felt it would be easier to return to, and it definitely has been for my project. So I think this book of minutes really identifies the mundane pieces of an organization that truly point to what the organization's values are. And so I didn't quote, but in that last quote I shared with you, you probably see it here. Everything is named. There's names of the people that hosted the party. There's the types of food that they had. There's the type of music that they played. There's the theme that they had. There's efforts for fundraising. There's just so much information here on the day-to-day lives of these women, including a gap during oh no, I'm going to get the year wrong since I'm not a historian, with the Spanish influenza, since that was during this time frame. So very interesting, but really kind of getting an inside look at who these women were and what they valued and prioritized. So to get a little bit deeper into this book of minutes, we are going to go on to some of the rituals that they had. So the chapter typically opened and closed their meetings with universal United Daughters of the Confederacy traditions. This includes references to a singing of Dixie and the reading of the Confederate prayer immediately following the Lord's Prayer. The prayer, though one instance of these traditions, is filled with what I would consider a type of martyrdom. So I want you to imagine the words of the Confederate prayer spoken in unison among a group of elite white women, as I think it begins to paint a picture of a revised Confederate memory that likely occurred during these meetings. And so the Confederate prayer says, I ask for strength that I might achieve. I was made weak that I might learn humbly to obey. I ask for health that I might do greater things. I was given infirmity that I might do better things. I ask for riches that I might be happy. I was given poverty. None of these women were impoverished 30 years later, of course. That I might be wise. I asked for power, that I might have the praise of men. I was given weakness, that I might feel the need of God. I asked for all things, that I might enjoy life. I was given life, that I might enjoy all things. I got nothing that I asked, but everything I had hoped for. Almost despite myself, my unspoken prayers were answered. I am among all people most richly blessed. So such traditions and values are a typical element to most group meetings. And the very back of the book also has the lyrics to Dixie. I believe it was also sung at most of the chapter meetings. And it's a little bit blurry of an image, but it is the words to Dixie that I believe most of us, if you are familiar with the song that we no longer sing, I believe most of those words are here today. So I wanted to share too that the last entry in this book of minutes, which was dated at the end of 1933, records a few key foreboding elements of the chapter's work. So they mentioned explicitly that no area Confederate veterans are currently alive, which has allowed them to sort of question the future purposes, since they were really claimed to sort of be built under the guise of helping Confederate veterans. The fact that the Confederate veterans were gone helped them start kind of questioning what their purposes were. Additionally, their program was on Confederate monuments in Arkansas, so they had moved from putting them up to talking about how they put them up. So the group had officially moved away from the stated mission of honoring veterans and just sort of a new mission of keeping this memory alive. So I also wanted to share a box of badges and ribbons that I think is really interesting and neat to explore, including some from the day of the unveiling. So let's make sure that video is rolling. Good to go. So Elizabeth Cox discusses, it's not Elizabeth Cox. Cox discusses the legacy the daughters' Confederate mothers left for them, which I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation. A more patriotic spirit than their men, as we found, while also pushing against and flipping the gender norms and expectations of the day. The network of the UDC is immersed in the past. However, these ancestors of the UDC also pushed them into the future in some ways. So these kind of women that they venerated in many ways pushed the UDC women forward. So the women of the James H. Berry UDC were situated at the beginning and continuation of women's rights at the time period that our special collections has most of their materials. Cox mentions that in its heyday, a political office in the United Daughters of the Confederacy was the highest office a woman could receive. Even within the chapter, we see the power that the president and other officers held at meetings. The meeting minutes were always signed by the president and the secretary, officers, and we see the yearly election of officers recorded as a major event in the chapter. Further, the badges and ribbons that you're seeing here, to me at least, resemble military honors or other forms of recognition that up until this point had mostly been achieved and accessible to men. Based on names and local records, we know too that the officers as well as the members were from prominent families in the region. Therefore, we can begin to see the James H. Berry UDC as a political means of networking, as well, particularly as women began to seek power and equality within the nation. So in some ways, I think this group, and that's the one from the unveiling actually, in some ways I really feel like this group, had their ancestors sort of at the back that they were venerating and trying to maintain, but also sort of pushing against that in a lot of ways and the independence they tried to create in their chapter. So just an important and interesting note. Oh, and that was perfect timing for the video. So another major artifact that I want to share is Ruth's scrapbook. So one prominent member of the Berry family and the chapter, Ruth Dickinson Berry, James H. Berry's daughter-in-law, went on to become a pioneering journalist and community activist in the region. Her method of activism, of course, included social standing in the United Daughters of the Confederacy, the Daughters of the American Revolution, the Red Cross, and the Chi Omega sorority. These organizations continue to have an outreach and an impact on our society today. Throughout her time in these organizations, Ruth kept a scrapbook of newspaper clippings that must have seemed significant to her community and moments in time. These clippings included a romanticizing of slavery, an understatement of the motivations behind the Civil War, and a clear interest in global aid/international mission work in place of domestic civil rights concerns. There's a lot about international aid in this, which we've seen with other white women into the present day, instead of focusing on domestic civil rights concerns. An article that is featured here that I should have been paying attention. I don't know if I've shown it here yet, but it's not an amazing copy, so it's okay if you don't physically see it, but I want to tell you about it. So an article called Faithful Slaves of the 60s is listed as the second place prize in the United Daughters of the Confederacy Essay Contest Junior High Group. So the author of that essay interviews Adeline Blakely, who is used a lot. We've seen her in Historical Society records and the Workers Program Administration slave narratives, as she was interviewed by white women, and the perspective that the white women give her, the voice that they provide for her based on the interviews, is that she presents a really glossy image of slavery that makes it appear as if she enjoyed it or preferred it. So this essay contest mentions stories of faithfulness, quote, except for a few cases of unruly and unappreciative individuals, unquote. The article also ends in saying, quote, we are glad that we do not have slaves today, but never need a but. But the faithfulness of the slaves during peacetime, war, and after the war testifies to the fact that the white man did the right thing toward African Americans, but they do use a different word that I don't feel I am qualified to use. Though there's no date, but I will keep looking, the article is found among others from the 40s and 50s, right on the verge of the civil rights movement. It's kind of pieced together with those. Further, its association and sponsorship by the United Daughters of the Confederacy. There's another example right there on the screen with Jefferson Davis's quote servant. So further, its association and sponsorship by the United Daughters of the Confederacy is a direct example of the propaganda and status that they hoped to maintain. So I just think the Ruth's scrapbook I've returned to again and again, and I'm still actively working on in my project, because I think the things that she chose to keep really speak to her interests, maybe some of her confusion, maybe some of the talk that she was hearing at the time, and of course, the groups that she was involved in as well. So really interesting collection of articles that I think testify to the community that weren't from that long ago. So I also just want to touch base, those are the more specific highlights, but I want to spend a little time just talking about other UDC ephemera, which I'm just meaning the little seemingly inconsequential pieces of these women's lives that I think really tell a story of the legacy that they left behind for us. So based on the privilege of institutional preservation, which, as we all know in our collections, we've talked about it within special collections. So there's an inherent privilege in what has been historically chosen to be saved and how it's saved. Again, thinking about the white perspective that provided that story of Adeline Blakely, we have a very white perspective here in what's chosen to be saved, as well as a family trust in leaving their records with the white institution of the university, which I think we all recognize. There's a level of trust in providing your memories here. So we still know many of the very specific names of these women. We know that they were heavily influenced by their mothers and grandmothers, as well as I've mentioned, the stories and myths of the women of the 1860s. So the Confederate men treated their women with deep, if not patronizing, veneration. Cox points out that, quote, whenever one of their monuments was unveiled, the daughters were rewarded for being dutiful to the Confederate generation, unquote. The speeches and references given to the daughters borders on silly veneration, with poetic, flowing, and sometimes patronizing rhetoric. In a proposal for a monument to Arkansas Confederate women, the dedication reads, quote, everywhere will be seen that face and figure of Southern beauty and power, looking down with inspiring love and tenderness upon the rising generations of the Southland, unquote. This is waxed profanely in a collection of recollections of Confederate women of Arkansas, which is housed in our library. I would encourage you to read it. I thought I had my copy right here, but I don't. So one of the quotes from that book says, quote, the women who wove and spun the clothing of the Southern soldier and their own, who risked their lives in bearing important dispatches to Confederate generals, who spent days and nights at the cot of the soldier in the hospital, and who have cared for the graves of the Confederate dead, even to the extent of erecting countless memorial monuments and leaving their own heroism to be unnoticed, if not unknown, deserve to be commemorated in the grandest records and finest monuments that man's genius can devise, unquote. So we see that in many ways, the network of ghosts of these women of the 60s, these mythical women, I say mythical, I know that they were real, but the way we've built them up, or the way that these women had built them up, likely played a large part of the motivation of the actions and reflections of the James H. Berry United Daughters of the Confederacy. So back in that letter that I kind of zoomed in on for the Book of Minutes, Ruth Dickinson Berry states that, quote, I fill the office with which you have honored me in very poor fashion, but everything that concerns the beautiful story of the Southern Confederacy and the men and women who lived and wrought through those trying years is very near to my heart. I think our organization means much to us and more to our Southland, unquote. Cox theorizes that in many ways, the ancestors and role models of the UDC shaped who it was and who it became. An organization founded on one's literal ancestorship in connection to the Confederacy, and I should have mentioned this, but that was one of the rules of membership into the United Daughters of the Confederacy, and still is. The organization is still very active, even if our local chapter was dispersed, I think around the 70s, the Bentonville Confederate chapter, is proving a literal ancestorship to the Confederacy. So the group had, to a degree, been emboldened and empowered by the women they admired, the women of the 1860s. Confederate women, according to the lost cause narratives, had one foot planted in the domestic sphere and one foot in the public sphere. So understanding the role of other women in the James H. Berry United Daughters of the Confederacy and the individual role of women like Ruth Dickinson Berry allows us to see their broader tentacles in the community work of the day. Even under the guise of philanthropy or women's rights, we are shrouded in the ethos and thought process of white supremacy that they were raised in, that they raised their children in, and that those children raised children in. Beginning with a legacy of their own ancestors, these community ancestors shaped a network, a legacy, a culture of whiteness and privilege that turned a blind eye, or maybe more actively pushed out or literally whitewashed, as I've mentioned several times, their African-American community members. Though our family records end in the 1970s, this network continues to this day. So finally, since I know that this is probably a point of interest for a lot of people right now, as it should be, it's an important moment in our community, I believe, I wanted to leave you with another major highlight of this collection, which is, of course, information on the Bentonville Confederate Monument. Just a few years after the James H. Berry United Daughters of the Confederacy placed the monument, Mrs. E.R. Berry created a very comprehensive report that you can see here, kind of behind me, I'm about to show it, a very comprehensive report for the chapter that is located in box 10, which I have listed here, of the Berry, Dickinson, and Peel papers. So Mrs. E.R. Berry, and I'm going to read the beginning, and then we've got it here posted as well with what's written on the statue, because I think it's gone now, so you can't see it for now, but it's going to be put in a private park. But I think it's important to hear those words and sort of see them in a woman's handwriting who helped put this up. To me, that's a very powerful, tangible moment. So Mrs. E.R. Berry states that the monument is erected in a beautiful grove in the center of the square at Bentonville. It is a beautiful berry, cement granite, and was ordered through a local marble firm from Chas R. Scott of Berry Cement. The monument is surrounded by a figure representing a Confederate infantryman at parade rest. And then they get into some of the dimensions, but I wanted to share the words that are listed here. So on the west side, to the Southern soldiers, and then who it was erected by. A.J. Bates was a major donor as well as a Confederate soldier. August 8th, 1908. Their name is borne on honor shield. Their record is with God. They fought for home and fatherland, 1861 to 1865. And then Miss Berry ends the report by saying, the monument is pronounced, this is a quote, by all who have seen it to be well proportioned and splendidly situated. Its location is such that it is seen by everyone who comes to Bentonville. And then she goes on to give credit to Mrs. W.F. Patton, who helped found the chapter. The statue is not, at its face, to a white person at least, an outward sign of explicit racism. Or perhaps it is, now that we're engaging in these conversations. I think as a country, we've started to recognize that perhaps it is. Its words like honor shield and fatherland suggest a sort of martyrdom typical of many military statues. If one is to take such words into context, however, a subtler undertone in both the report and the words can be perceived. The first side that Miss E.R. Berry chose to report on is the fact that the statue features the word Confederate on all four sides, which I didn't put here, but that is part of this bigger report. As you saw, it's a couple pages of the statue. Such placement makes no mistake as to the sort of veneration that the women felt most tied to, the cause of the Confederacy. This is only continued in the second set of words in which Miss Berry makes a report to the Southern soldiers. The use of the word Southern here sets a tone of heritage that I believe is echoed into the present day. Further, this tone of veneration and heritage minimizes the racism and the cause that these men were fighting for. Their record is with God only echoes the tone of overall martyrdom that allows many to claim honor in place of racism in the fight to remove, or alongside racism really, in the fight to remove the statue, as we might see in our present day comments, which I want to share with you today. And so here we are. I wanted to share, these are just a few of the, well, there were 14,000 people who signed the petition to keep the James H. Berry statue. The Confederate, the petition termed it the James H. Berry statue. It's of course not a statue of James H. Berry, but it is of a Confederate soldier that the James H. Berry chapter put up. These are three, I left them anonymous, public comments that were left out of many, many that were left to keep the statue that I think really echo the legacy that's there today. One says, Bentonville has lost so much of its history as it is. This was one of my favorite hangout places in the late 90s. My family has many roots and history in the beloved town. It's so sad to see history being erased. I have ancestors that fought in this war, and I feel as though this monument stands for all them boys who fought. And history should not be forgotten or erased. And I'll let you finish that one yourself. So here we are. Though the materials, through the materials they intentionally and accidentally left behind, those certified documents and kind of the ephemera, these women showed me, as I explored through these special collections, and continue to, this is an ongoing project, their values, their people, their beliefs. Though for many years, the physical statues and symbolic ways in which these women honored their Confederate veterans was seemingly innocuous, I have to believe that we have entered into a conversation that allows us to more carefully consider the roots that these statements have. For instance, Ruth Dickinson Berry's scrapbook all the way into the 1970s, where we see through her coverage of the civil rights movement, maybe her own conflicts with placing her ideologies in that present moment. The badges and honors and rituals begun by the UDC might be reflected in other women's societies, even unintentionally, such as sororities, many of which these women were part of. The veil of reverence, of solemnity, and of heritage is still carefully utilized in the present day and can be seen, even as late as 2017 on petitions to keep the Bentonville Confederate statue right where it is. The legacies these women fought for and the carefully worded rhetoric they used to espouse it echoes in the communities I'm part of today. So I want to close with a quote that's actually about Black English, but I feel like it really resonates with what I'm wrestling with in my project and listening to really dismantle the ways that white supremacy is a part of our everyday life and language, and making space to create a more equitable society where all voices are heard. So Patricia Hill Collins, who wrote the tenets, I think her book is just called Black Feminist Thought, but the tenets of Black Feminist Thought, she quotes June Jordan in saying, and I have the quote here, quote, "Our language is a system constructed by people constantly needing to insist that we exist. Our language devolves from a culture that abhors all abstraction or anything tending to obscure or delete the fact of the human being who is here and now, / the truth of the person who is speaking or listening. Consequently, there is no passive voice construction possible in Black English. For example, you cannot say Black English is being eliminated. You must say instead, white people eliminating Black English. The assumption of the presence of life governs all of Black English. Every sentence assumes the living and active participation of at least two human beings, the speaker and the listener." And again, I know that's about language, but I think that that is really reflected, especially kind of juxtaposing it against the comments we just read, to speak to the larger and sort of infiltrated ways in which white supremacy and ideologies come to light that we see reflected in these women of the James H. Berry chapter of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. So Hill Collins' inclusion of Black English in her text on Black feminist thought perfectly sums up, I believe, the never-ending work we have to do in dismantling white supremacy, not only in our words, but in the very ways that we remember. A statue put up in 1908 epitomizes the subtle but present white supremacist, racist language that we see reflected in calls to maintain the monument. Despite a claim of, quote, colorblind racism, these comments attest to the work that needs to be done. Understanding the role of other women in the James H. Berry United Daughters of the Confederacy and the individual role of women like Ruth Dickinson Berry allows us to see their broader tentacles in the community work of the day. Even under the guise of philanthropy or women's rights, we are shrouded in the ethos and thought process of white supremacy. So though our family records end in the 1970s, this network continues to this day. We must therefore begin the simple yet impossible task of acknowledging our own complicity in white supremacy, which I say it's simple, I know it's not simple, I say it's impossible, and it's not impossible to acknowledge our own complicity in this white supremacy work, and that's what I am attempting to listen to and take part in. I feel as a white woman, this is work I feel as a white Southern woman is critical to take up and to recognize in order to move forward. So we sort of started this presentation with that garden. Where do we go from here? And I think that where we go from here is continuing to read the voices of our past, dig into our community ancestors, which for me are these women, to discover how I can move forward here at the university, here in our community, and here today. So thank you. I do want to share my sources page and kind of leave you with that, because there's a lot of amazing further reading. I, of course, am a little biased because these are all just incredible texts that have really helped me out. I really tried to center my work in Black feminist thought, and I'd love to talk to you more about that. And as I mentioned from the beginning, I'd love to just continue to explore areas where my perspective is short-sighted, because I definitely understand where it can be. If you're willing to pick up the work with me, I would love to discuss this with you. So I thank you. I thank Special Collections for their work with me and with lots of other scholars to help us really dive into what I'm, using and kind of referring to as our ancestral work. And I, at this time, am happy to accept any and all questions.
Well, thank you again, Katie. So at this point, we're going to open it up to the Q&A portion. So let's see here. We had one person who had to drop off early, but Katie, they wanted to let you know that it was very informative. We had another comment about the badges and ribbons in particular. So their comment was basically that apparently this is the badges and ribbons were something that both daughters of the Confederacy and daughters of the Union soldiers who had, I guess, similar groups. They both of those groups had those kinds of badges and ribbons. So this person is saying that the women modeled their groups, as I understand the way these groups are created, the women modeled their groups after the men's groups. So it isn't something that the women made up themselves. And her comment was just that maybe she'd like to see that more clearly in your presentation. We got some other positive comments coming in.
No, thank you. Yeah, I think that is a really important point. And I haven't researched that much outside of actually what's in our special collections, and then just in a couple of cursory looks at the United Daughters of the Confederacy. There's just a few scholars that study them, but I could definitely see where a lot of the traditions in rituals and officerships and ribbons and things like that would be based on men's groups. So I'll definitely look into that.
We also got a question about being able to watch this again and if there will be a transcript that participants can read. So this will be available on YouTube after this event is over, and I've gotten it uploaded. So everyone who's registered will receive a YouTube link when that goes live, so you can revisit this as many times as you would like. I do believe that Zoom will produce a transcript as well. So yeah, but the YouTube video will include the closed captions again as well, if you want to read it that way. Okay, we have a question about, oh my goodness, we have a lot of questions coming in, sorry. They're like moving up the page. All right, let me see here. One person asked if you've interviewed any existing UDC groups in the Northwest Arkansas region.
Great question. No, I actually have not interviewed anybody specifically in the University of Arkansas, or sorry, in the Northwest Arkansas region. I haven't planned to yet, but I feel like before my dissertation is over, it would be great to interview some current members. I've met some members of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, but it wasn't in a formal interview capacity, so I'm not able to use it in my research. But I am definitely interested in engaging and learning a little bit more about kind of present day United Daughters of the Confederacy traditions. I mentioned it briefly in my dissertation. I know that the James H. Berry UDC is not active at the moment. All of the news and the kind of press releases that we've heard, as they've been in the news, of course, this summer, have been from the state chapter. But no, I haven't interviewed anybody yet, but it's not out of the realm of possibility with my dissertation if anybody is potentially willing to share their perspective.
Another kind of, in a similar vein, a question about maybe if you have any interest in interviewing, or if you've talked to any descendants of the people represented in the collection that you were using in your research?
Yeah, I haven't yet. I have seen in some newspaper articles, there's quite a bit in the news on some descendants speaking in regards to conversations, particularly around the Bentonville Confederate Monument a few years ago. So I have used some of those resources where they have made statements and things like that. I haven't interviewed anybody specifically, and I still think I would like to, but this is actually part of my larger dissertation, and so it's not not the full capacity specifically on the monument or specifically on the family even, though it's, I think, obviously a very important part. And I think it's important to get firsthand accounts. I'm also focusing just kind of on the larger community. So I've done a lot of work in the petitions. I shared just 3 or 4 of those, but the petitions and some of the public discourse that's out there, because I think it's really interesting to read and review the public discourse that's going to be archived as well. But yes, I have seen in some descendants post statements and things like that in the news, and have potentially started plans to ask for the perspective as well.
All right, another question, sort of a many-pronged question.
Yeah.
So one person is asking if you can speak to the suffragist movement and how it intersected with the Bentonville UDC, if at all. Were any members suffragists? Did their sort of politics in the UDC translate into other activism?
Great question. So I can't speak as an expert on that at all. So I can tell you what I think I know, but I can't speak as kind of an expert on UDC suffrage connections. I do know that there was some overlap. The women that were involved in the United Daughters of the Confederacy were very active in their communities. And so there's some records, and I'll have to think about which box they were in, some records of women's rights movements and suffragist movements that are posted there. I also kind of touched on it in the presentation, but I really feel that the way that the United Daughters of the Confederacy was structured, and the role that the women played in the community, I think they really set themselves up in their own definition of an activist effort within the community. So the leadership positions that they played within the UDC, I think, and this is Katie Powell's opinion, were in kind of response to some of the suffragist movements. I think they were all sort of combined because the James H. Berry UDC is very similar to a lot of other chapters and the actions and kind of the timeline that they were on, which leads me to feel like they really were connected and kind of inspired by the suffragist movement in a push toward gaining independence. And what I think the women of the United Daughters of the Confederacy did is work within their worlds to construct that within their organization. Because I don't know if you guys saw it, I think there's similarities in like the badges and ribbons, I think in the way that they're organized. And then again, the activist efforts that we see from them in other areas. I think I mentioned Daughters of the American Revolution, but there was also some Red Cross help. Most of the college-age women were in sororities at the University of Arkansas, and so there's a philanthropic component there. So I guess philanthropy is probably a better term than activism, but definitely that same vein, and I think kind of going in tandem with the women's suffragist movement.
Yeah, somebody else just added on a comment about the tie-in with the Chi Omega sorority. So
yes,
like what you're saying with philanthropy.
Yeah, that's the one most noted is Chi Omega, but I think we just have the Barry Dickinson and Peel papers, and so I'm not sure the identities of the other women.
Someone asked where you're from in Mississippi, and they can relate to your thoughts on being your family's worst nightmare.
Oh, yeah.
Or your ancestors' worst nightmare.
Yeah, I'm from the coast of Mississippi, actually, from the coast. And then I have our family roots are my work is on ancestorship, but I haven't actually traced my literal ancestors. I think we have a lot of roots in North Carolina and then back in Mississippi, quite a few generations.
All right, let's see here. Got another one that just came in. Your role in researching the past via public discourse involves listening to a lot of various perspectives. Can you tell me more about listening and how you enter those spaces as a listener?
Oh, I can try. Yes. So I think, I guess for me, I enter those spaces as a listener, and my personality is one to lead. I'm very quick to jump in and volunteer for things and say yes to things, or avoid uncomfortable silences. I'm a very talkative person, and so I think my tendency, I've always been this way, is to just like step in when there's silence. So I think for me, one of the best ways I've learned to be a better listener is just to sit in silence that might come, discomfort that might come, or lack of initiative. I think maybe not initiative, but action. I've really tried to do a better job just sitting with whatever problem we're confronting or work that we're doing, and not be the first one to propose a solution, not be the first one to move into action, etc. The other piece of my dissertation, which doesn't involve special collections, is with the Washington County Community Remembrance Project. And so I'm in a group, a community group, where I'm really trying to practice a lot of listening, that's working to venerate, I don't know if you've heard of it, but working to put up a plaque that venerates 3 enslaved men that were lynched in our area in 1856. And so with that group, we're a multiracial group, and I've really tried to apply those concepts, I think, in that space. And then also, kind of as I mentioned at the end, in my community here at the university, you know, where can I take a step back? Where can I not be the first one to jump into action? Or the first one to say, oh, no, we should do it this way, because I think I've learned that those are products of a white supremacist culture, and by actively not following those instincts, I've really learned so much about what's possible, and hope to continue. I hope that helps answer the question.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting and important question, especially with
yes,
with this kind of topic. All right, we have another one. How did you find this project? What was your jumping off point? Or do you have like a memory of when you realized that you wanted to focus on this for your dissertation?
Yes. So I actually started with this work with the news of the University of Mississippi's Confederate monument there on their campus in the Lyceum Circle. There was a lot of news stories in, I want to say 2016, of them recontextualizing what's there. So instead of taking the statue down, University of Mississippi had originally planned to just contextualize it and make notes, kind of put a new plaque there that explains the historical significance. And so I followed that story actually in my first class for the doctorate, because it was all about words and the discourse that we're using in these 2 plaques, or excuse me, there was 1 plaque, and then there was a kind of a community outcry input in a new plaque. So that, following that story, got me really interested in the overall discourse and discussion. And then I think from there, I received information and obviously noticed that we had a Confederate statue here in Bentonville, and was curious about conversations surrounding that. So I started following those conversations, and then was curious if we had conversations around putting other types of plaques up, found information about that. And so it kind of spiraled from there.
Great.
Yeah, I think just too, I was aware that I was a white person doing this work, and I felt like it was really important to figure out what my role in that is, and then how to help other white people discuss and explore and kind of confront what our role in those works are. Sorry, quick addition.
Okay, we have another question. What was your entree to special collections? How'd you get into special collections research for your dissertation?
Yeah, so Joshua Youngblood's blog was probably the most helpful, just as I started expressing interest in the Bentonville Confederate Monument. I saw that we had boxes of material around the women that put, there's very little in the monument itself, as I showed you, 1 full box. But I think that was my entree into the collection. And I guess now that I think about it, I hadn't thought about it in a while, but I really did start out more explicitly thinking I was going to cover monument and memorial debates. And of course, I've been continuing that conversation because it's been such a prevalent national conversation. But as I started looking, and especially I think the real, I guess, entree was that book of minutes that I showed you, and reading these very mundane daily activities that the women participated in. I think that's when I realized that I really wanted to focus on the broader cultural phenomenon that was taking place around the monument, and not necessarily the monument itself.
All right. So that covers pretty much all the questions that I am seeing in the chat. If anyone wants to get in one last question, we have a little bit of time left, but thank you again, Katie, for sharing your research with all of us, and thank you to everybody who tuned in for this live lunchtime event. We really appreciate it. Let's see here. We did get a question kind of more, maybe I'm missing one. Oh, okay. This is a good question to end on, I think. So what are your plans for this project going forward? And what are you working on now?
Oh, great. Yes. So I am in the process of drafting my dissertation. I hope to graduate this May. And so, as I mentioned, this is part of my dissertation. I guess you could technically call it half of my dissertation, because half of what I'm looking at basically two physical reminders of community memory. So one, of course, is the Bentonville Confederate Monument and the women that were responsible for putting it together. The other is a plaque that the Washington County Community Remembrance Project group is putting up to venerate Aaron, Anthony, and Randall, the three enslaved men who were lynched in 1856. So I'm looking at both of those sort of instances of, or really physical objects of public memory, and trying to address the conversations that are centered around those. So for this year, that comes with drafting my dissertation, which I could, of course, go on about the chapters and all that good stuff. But I'm mostly focusing on, in those conversations, the motivations behind putting them up, the publics that are centered around that, which is where my ancestor work comes in, the words that we're using when we have these conversations, and then the locations that these places are in, which, as we all know, one of them has actively been moving around quite a bit. So more to update on my places chapter. And so, yes, my plans now are to finish my dissertation for May. And then, of course, like any good doctoral candidate, I am working on turning part of that dissertation into an article for a peer-reviewed journal to hopefully submit sometime soon. And I'm also, just as a, I guess, kind of a plug, I don't know, help teaching an OLLI class that's similar to this in November, early November. So I'll be teaching on place and memory and kind of combining those two places.
Very cool. Well, yeah, so if you're interested in learning more or listening to Katie talk more about this, that OLLI class sounds like a great opportunity to kind of dig into that more deeply. All right. Well, I think we will end it there. Thanks again, everybody, for tuning in. And again, you will all receive the YouTube link to the recorded version of this presentation and the Q&A just as soon as Zoom spits it out to me and I upload it to YouTube. All right. Thanks again, everybody. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you so much. Thank you all in Special Collections. Thanks, Kara.
Thanks.